Earth, the European night was unusually quiet. A thin layer of winter mist floated above Kyiv as streetlights painted long shadows across the empty avenues. But beneath the silence, the capital felt heavier than ever before. The war, now stretching far beyond what anyone expected, had worn down the spirit of the country, its leadership, and even its allies. Rumors were circulating once again. Rumors that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was under increasing pressure, both at home and abroad. And at the center of the latest storm was a warning allegedly delivered by former U.S. President Donald Trump, a message that had triggered endless discussions in political circles. Was Zelensky finally ready to accept defeat? The question lingered in military headquarters, diplomatic halls, and public conversation alike. But how had it come to this moment? How had a conflict that once electrified global unity now turned into a grinding test of endurance, straining Ukraine's alliances and pushing its leadership into one of the most challenging political calculations of their lifetime? Across the ocean, Trump's return to the political spotlight once again altered global equations. His blunt and unpredictable style always carried weight, whether people agreed with him or not. His comment, delivered during a closed-door meeting but swiftly leaked by insiders, echoed throughout the international media. If Ukraine wants peace, they know what they need to do. This war won't end without difficult decisions. Some interpreted it as a warning. Others saw it as a push toward negotiation. But in Kyiv, the message hit harder than expected. For a nation surviving on Western military aid and diplomatic support, the slightest shift in American political winds could change everything. Inside Ukraine's presidential office, the pressure was unlike anything Zelensky had faced since the first days of the invasion. Advisors were split. Some argued that Ukraine must keep fighting until every occupied inch was reclaimed. Others insisted that continuing without a guaranteed flow of weapons would be strategically dangerous and morally irresponsible. Soldiers on the front had already been reporting ammunition shortages, exhausted rotations, and constant drone bombardments. Some brigades had been pushed beyond their limits, holding lines simply because there was no one left to replace them. Foreign analysts began stating openly what had previously been whispered: Ukraine may have reached the most critical turning point since the war began. Meanwhile, Moscow believed the tides were shifting in its favor. Russian state television aired nightly segments predicting Ukraine's collapse, mocking Western promises, and celebrating every village captured. In Kremlin strategy meetings, officials sensed an opportunity. If Kyiv was truly under pressure from Washington, it could weaken Ukraine's negotiating position dramatically. And for President Vladimir Putin, a strategic victory, whether military or political, would be enough to reshape Russia's global image and secure leverage for years to come. But Ukraine was not ready to simply fold. For over 2 years, the country had proven again and again that its greatest weapon was resilience. Zelensky's entire presidency had become defined by his refusal to give up, even in the darkest moments. Accepting defeat was unthinkable for many Ukrainians. It would mean acknowledging the loss of territories, homes, and lives. Entire cities had turned to rubble. Thousands of families had been split across borders. Millions of citizens who fled now feared what a political concession might mean. Surrender wasn't just a political decision, it was a national wound that could define generations. Yet the harsh truth remained: soldiers cannot fight without supplies. Drones cannot fly without parts. Artillery cannot hold back advances when it runs silent. The latest U.S. Congress debates about military funding had sent shivers across European capitals. If America paused or reduced its support, other NATO nations feared they could not fill the gap alone. And Trump's political influence, whether or not he held office, was undeniably reshaping American opinion. Public pressure in the U.S. was shifting toward focusing on domestic priorities rather than foreign conflicts. Ukraine's intelligence services were tracking every signal, every statement, every fluctuating commitment. Zelensky met European leaders behind closed doors, stressing that this was not just Ukraine's war, it was Europe's security. It was the future of the world order, but even among allies, patience was thinning. Some nations quietly questioned how long they could maintain support, especially as economic stress and political divisions grew at home. Inside Kyiv, the presidential war room remained illuminated day and night. Maps covered the walls, marking Russian positions, drone attack routes, and possible negotiation scenarios. Zelensky, once a symbol of optimism and defiance, now faced the most complex political equation of his career. Every option seemed dangerous. Fighting risked further losses, negotiating risked political fallout and public outrage. A ceasefire could save lives but freeze the conflict in Russia's favor. And accepting defeat, if that phrase was even conceivable, would turn him into the most controversial figure in Ukrainian history. But what exactly had Trump said that triggered such intense speculation? Sources claimed that Trump's warning was direct. If Ukraine expected future U.S. assistance, it must be ready to make hard choices. Some interpreted this as a push toward negotiation, maybe even territorial concessions. Others viewed it as a strategic tactic: pressure Kyiv, pressure Moscow, and force both sides to the bargaining table under a new U.S.-led peace framework. For Trump's supporters, this was common sense: bring an end to the war. For critics, it was a disastrous signal that could weaken Ukraine and embolden Russia. In Kyiv, the fear was not simply about losing support. It was about losing leverage. Every Russian advance on the battlefield made negotiations harder. Every Western hesitation made Ukraine's position weaker, and every political shift in Washington threatened to change the entire trajectory of the conflict. Yet Zelensky understood something that outsiders often overlooked. War is not just fought with weapons, it is fought with psychology. Ukraine's entire defense relied on belief that victory was possible, that allies would stand by them, that every sacrifice meant something. If leadership showed even the slightest sign of giving up, morale could collapse instantly. Soldiers on the front, civilians in shelters, and refugees abroad were holding onto the hope that Ukraine would prevail. If that hope dissolved, everything could crumble quickly. So, was Zelensky truly ready to accept defeat? Behind closed doors, the answer was far more complex than any headline could capture. Zelensky knew the weight of every word. A public acknowledgement of defeat would devastate the nation, but preparing for the possibility of difficult negotiations was a private reality he could not ignore. Even the most determined leader must consider contingencies. Even the bravest fighter must adapt to the battlefield. In late-night strategic sessions, Zelensky spoke with his top commanders. They reviewed casualty numbers, ammunition levels, drone losses, and upcoming supply timelines. The truth was undeniable. Ukraine needed more support to continue at the current intensity. Without it, the situation would shift from difficult to dangerous. But defeat, that word did not sit easily with anyone in the room. Ukraine's military leaders insisted that Russia's forces were also exhausted, stretched thin along a massive front line, and suffering significant losses. They argued that Russia's appearance of strength was often exaggerated for propaganda. And they reminded Zelensky that Ukraine had survived the impossible before, from the Battle of Kyiv to the defense of Kharkiv to the liberation of Kherson. Each time, analysts predicted collapse, and each time Ukraine defied expectations. Meanwhile, Europe scrambled to devise new support packages, new training programs, new defense industrial cooperation initiatives. NATO states were desperately trying to increase ammunition production, but building factories was not as fast as firing artillery. Time was becoming a more valuable resource than money. As the pressure intensified, Zelensky faced another challenge: growing political opposition within Ukraine. Critics accused him of relying too heavily on Western promises. Others demanded clearer communication about the strategy ahead. Some even argued that the government must begin exploring diplomatic channels more seriously, if only to understand Russia's current demands. Zelensky's popularity, once sky-high, had started to waver, but the president maintained his resolve. To the public, he vowed that Ukraine would never accept defeat, but to his advisors, he asked the difficult questions. What would negotiations look like? What territory could Ukraine reasonably hold? What red lines were truly non-negotiable? How would security guarantees work? What would happen to millions of displaced citizens? And perhaps most painfully, how could they ensure that the sacrifices of thousands of soldiers were not in vain? Across the border, Russia watched with interest. Putin believed time was on his side. Russia's strategy had evolved: grind down Ukraine slowly, exhaust Western patience, and wait for political changes in the United States. If Trump or any leader with similar views shifted America's position, it would reshape the conflict instantly. Russia strengthened its fortifications, increased drone production, and attempted to secure partnerships with nations willing to provide missile components and ammunition. Every signal from Washington was analyzed in the Kremlin with surgical precision. Yet, despite its apparent confidence, Russia was also under pressure. Sanctions had deeply impacted its economy. Its military suffered enormous casualties. Domestic dissatisfaction simmered, even if not publicly visible. And behind the scenes, Russian diplomats quietly assessed what a ceasefire might look like if the opportunity arose. As winter deepened and the war approached another year, the world sensed a shift. Nothing was certain anymore, not military outcomes, not political decisions, not global alliances. The war had reached a stage where narratives mattered as much as strategies. The question dominating headlines, was Zelensky ready to accept defeat, was not just a question about Ukraine. It was a question about global unity, political will, and the limits of resilience. Inside Kyiv, Zelensky finally stepped away from his advisors and walked toward the balcony overlooking the city. Snowflakes drifted through the cold air. The distant hum of generators echoed across rooftops. He knew millions were relying on him to guide them through the storm. He had become not just a leader, but a symbol of resistance, defeat. The word haunted him, but he also understood reality. War demanded clarity. Leadership demanded responsibility. Every choice carried consequences that would echo for generations. He wasn't ready to accept defeat, not publicly, not privately, but he was ready to confront the truth. Ukraine was entering the most decisive phase of the conflict. And whatever came next would require decisions far harder than any battlefield command. Trump's warning, intentional or not, had forced the world to confront a question it had long avoided. How much longer could the war continue without decisive action? How many more resources could allies provide? How much more suffering could Ukraine endure? And was a political settlement inevitable? The story of Ukraine was not ending. The struggle for sovereignty, identity, and survival would continue. But the era of simple slogans and absolute promises had passed. The world had entered a new stage, one defined by complex diplomacy, shifting alliances, and the recognition that even the strongest warriors must eventually negotiate the path to peace. As dawn approached, Zelensky prepared for another day filled with briefings, calls, and strategy sessions. The pressure remained immense, the questions remained unresolved, but one thing was certain: Ukraine would not walk into defeat. It would be forced, negotiated, or avoided, never accepted voluntarily. Whether Trump's warning would reshape the war or fade into political noise, only time would reveal. But the world was watching closely, knowing that every word, every decision, and every shift in momentum could determine the future not just of Ukraine, but of global stability. For now, Kyiv stood firm, exhausted but unbroken. And Zelensky, despite the pressure, prepared to continue the fight, not just on the battlefield, but in the political arena where wars are often truly decided.